Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Kathy Warner. I'm the director of the Paterno Fellows Program, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the first ever Paterno Fellows Forum. We hope this will become an annual event. It's our hope to combine the talents of our students and our faculty to begin to think about some of the pressing issues of our time. And today we're going to consider what is the common good, and should we always promote it? The Paterno Fellows Program, as we like to say, is really the pinnacle of honors education here at Penn State. The best and the brightest students at University Park are inevitably Paterno Fellows, and I think you'll agree with me on that front after our event this evening. Because we recognize that, of course, there are many, many, many smart people all around here, this event tonight has a very significant audience participation component. And that is to say, we're going to ask you to vote. You can use your cell phones to do that. We'll vote. If you wouldn't mind bringing up the statements, Dave. You'll see on the bottom there is a URL. You can use that. It's also on the sheet that you got that has the statements. And on the back, there's a QR code if you have that app. The idea will be we'll be asking you to vote 3 times. There'll be 3 rounds of voting, first in the beginning, and then after each of the panelists has explained their statement, and then at the very end of the evening. The purpose of that is we want to take, we know you're all very thoughtful and you have lots of your own ideas, but we want to invite people to listen to other kinds of ideas, even opposing ideas. And then perhaps at the end of the event, you'll rethink some of those ideas. Perhaps you'll even change your mind. The second other part of the audience participation is we're going to leave about 30 minutes for questions from the audience. And most of you, I hope, have gotten a card. If you have any questions, please just raise your hand, and either myself or Barb Edwards, who's over here, or Alice Greider, who's here, we'll come and collect your cards, and you can either direct a question to a particular panelist or just a general question. So we're very, very curious to hear your thoughts and comments on many of the ideas that will be expressed this evening. Lastly, I also want to invite everyone to, at the conclusion of this event, to come to a reception, which is just in the Mann Assembly Hall, just right outside this auditorium. Everyone is invited. Now I'd like to introduce each of our panelists, and this is the order in which they'll speak, starting with our first, Brendan Bernicker, who is a junior Paterno Fellow and a double philosophy and political science major. He's leaving very soon for Oxford, where he'll be over the summer. He got a scholarship to their Law and Society program. Then our next panelist is Mark Sentesy, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Camps and Ancient Mediterranean Studies. He's an expert on ancient philosophy with a particular interest in Aristotle and Plato, but also modern environmental philosophy. Next, we have Emily Kohlman, who is a senior Paterno Fellow, double Russian and journalism major. And next year, Emily will be a Fulbright Scholar in the Czech Republic. We also have Jonathan Marks, who is an associate professor of bioethics, humanities, and law. He's also in the philosophy department, and he's also a lawyer by training. And then we have Michele Kennerly, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Arts and Sciences and Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies. Her field is ancient rhetoric, but she's also written on Wonder Woman and her influence, which right about now strikes me as quite fitting. We also have Daniel Zahn, who is a sophomore Paterno Fellow. He's a triple major, English, Philosophy, and Communication Arts and Sciences, and he's very active in the Presidential Leadership Academy. Last but not least, we have Jeremy Engels, who is the Sherwin Early Career Professor in the Rock Ethics Institute and an Associate Professor in the Communication Arts and Sciences Department, and a yogi. So, keeping this collection of unruly characters in order is the formidable Christopher Moore, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies. His area of expertise is ancient Greek philosophy, but he also has a particular interest in the philosophy of literature, drama, and democratic theory. So, if you haven't already voted on which of these statements most closely matches your own, I would ask you to vote now. And we'll vote on these 3 statements, as I mentioned, after everyone has given their explanation of what their thinking was behind this statement, and then at the very end of this event, after we've had question and answers. So I'll give everybody just a few moments to vote, and then we will tabulate the results, and we'll do that tabulation at 3 points, and think about if there's been changes in your own views or in the group's views, and why that perhaps is so. You all done? Anybody need more time?
The keys are in the room. Hold on just 1 second.
Okay. Not to worry, we need your vote. Okay, just say when you're ready.
And you're square.
Okay. Well, please join me in giving a hand to our panelists. Here we go.
Are we
All right, there we go. What's that?
Are we
Yeah.
revealing the
Yeah,
scores?
we'll bring up the scores then, right?
Yes.
Okay, there you go. So here's our start. All right.
Sorry, Mark.
So here we go.
Great, thank you. So each speaker will have no more than 4 minutes to present his or her explanation for his or her statement. We're going to move in the direction from left to right. We're going to start with Brendan Bernicker. At 3.5 minutes, I'll give you 1 finger. This finger. With 15 seconds left, I'll give you 2 fingers. And at 4 minutes, there will be no fingers. There will only be very intense singing and closing of my ears.
Sounds good.
So please begin.
Sure. So I guess that makes me the first of our unruly characters. So to start us off, I want to lay out 2 ideas of what the common good could be and explain why I don't think either of them gives us a type of common good that could exist. And before I start into that, I want to go over one foundational idea that I think precludes us from having the concept of the common good, and that's the idea of reasonable pluralism. So for those of you who aren't familiar, pluralism, as opposed to reasonable pluralism, is just diversity, or is essentially just diversity of thought or a diversity of conceptions of the good, or ideas about what makes one's life worth living, or in our case, what makes a society good, what would constitute a societal flourishing. And so pluralism isn't necessarily a moral commitment. Pluralism itself is taken just kind of as a fact. So diversity of conceptions of the good exist. People, as you could see from the votes, have different ideas about what the common good might be, and that's the starting place for us to have our conversation. Reasonable pluralism is kind of a moral commitment. So taking pluralism for granted, it's a question of how do we deal with it. And reasonable pluralism is a commitment to recognizing as legitimate different ideas about what constitutes the good that people could hold as long as they're compatible with us living together in a society, and as long as they share certain commitments to, for example, treating citizens as free and equal individuals. So taking that for granted, the first idea of what the common good might be is that it's ideas about what is good for society that all or most of us share. And so if there were, for example, an idea that we could all say, yes, this is what's good for society, everybody's in full agreement, great, we have an idea about the common good. But history and experience tell us that that's not the case. People do disagree about what's good for society, and so there certainly isn't unanimity on that point. It's worth asking for a second whether we would need full unanimity to embrace that as a conception of the good. If everyone in the society, except for a small minority, says this is what's good for the society, are we justified in saying, okay, that's the common good and the minority view notwithstanding? And a commitment to reasonable pluralism says no. It says that if we're really serious about taking ideas that are different from our own and recognizing that people have a right to hold those ideas and to act on those ideas and to fulfill their own individual conceptions of the good, it's not enough to say most people think your conception of the good is wrong, even if it's the vast majority of people think your conception of the good is wrong. As long as your conception of the good is reasonable, as long as it's consistent with living together in a democratic society, it's not the place of a majority to tell a minority what they can believe, and especially when it contradicts ideas that come from more comprehensive political or religious or moral doctrines. And so the first conception of the good, one where the fact that a majority of people, or even everybody, share a conception of what is good for the society, there isn't one where everybody agrees, and if there were one where just a majority of people agreed, then it wouldn't truly be a common good, because it would be superimposing a majority view on a minority, and wouldn't be recognizing their right to hold dissenting views. So the second idea about what the common good might be is that it's something that is good for society irrespective of what people in the society consider good. And that runs into a similar issue, which is, first, we know from experience that people can't agree that something is objectively good for society. They just, there will be disagreements, and it would be improper for us to impose a majority view again and to say that something's objective when it's clearly, in our experience, subjective. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Mark Sentesy?
Thank you. So, if you know of the story of Noah's Ark, then I have a question for you. Why did God make Noah take all the animals with him? Why not just the animals that we eat and the food that we could eat? Why also the animals that can eat our food and maybe even eat us? My suggestion is that the message is something like, to survive, you have to take all living things with you. And the point that I want to make is that I kind of think God's right on this one. And I want to say something about why. So it's fairly obvious that all our actions have consequences that we're not aware of. To take one example, right now there's roughly 100 million tons of plastic floating in the North Pacific Gyre. Basketballs, Barbie dolls, plastic bags, shirt buttons. Plastics, they don't biodegrade, they break up into tiny little pieces, so the open ocean looks a lot like a snow globe, delicious and toxic. So there's more plastic there than plankton. But because of this, plastic is re-entering our food supply and it's affecting our health. So do we need to do this? No, not at all. The effects of our actions are largely due to, or they're only partly due to our individual choices. I might not take grocery bags when I go to the grocery store, but the food arrived at the grocery store in grocery bags, so in plastic bags. So the consequences of our action are determined mostly by how we structure our society and our economy. That is, on the human systems on which our actions depend and in which we are embedded. So we depend on these systems for everything, but these human systems also depend on the systems of nature and have impacts on nature. So to give you an example, coral are living creatures and their bones are made of calcium carbonate, but those bones are deteriorating because the carbon dioxide that we release is turning the oceans more acidic. So we affect everything on the earth. That's unavoidable. We affect everything on the earth because of our insertion and our being embedded into these human systems. But okay, so human systems also depend on these natural systems. The word sustainability is a good way to indicate this. Sustainability poses a very simple question. Can we keep doing this thing forever? And if we can't, it will stop, whether we want it to or not. So it's up to us to decide how much of what we're doing will be sustainable and how much won't be. So finally, I want to argue that doing good for natural things is good for us. So the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania recently concluded a 30-year study that showed that corn that was grown, farmed organically, uses half as much energy as conventionally industrial agriculture or genetically modified agriculture, and at the same time yields 17 to 31% more during times of drought, so it's more resilient. Why is this? Well, because organic farming makes the bugs, worms, and bacteria in the soil healthy, and this gives us better food. So our ability to eat depends on the health of the ecosystem in which we are embedded. And to circle back to our earlier examples, since the ocean is the basis of life on Earth, keeping plastic and carbon dioxide out of it is going to be good for us too. our good depends on and is inextricable from the good of other living things. So we should pursue these common goods because everything we do has effects on and depends on the systems of the natural world. Thereby, the common good is not just a human good.
Thank you. Emily Kohlman.
So this event is called a discussion place of ideas, and that is quite a concept considering my statement with a deliberation and public discourse and how it relates to the common good. So we live in such an interesting time right now with the internet and fake news and everything, and I'd like to take a look at it from that angle. So my guess is that many of you receive your news through your phone, whether you get news alerts from different media organizations or from social media. And a study last fall from Pew Research Center shows that nearly half of US adults get their news, all of their news, from just one location, and that is Facebook. And with the whole Cambridge Analytica, Facebook debacle right now, that brings a lot of questions into play. What kind of news are these people getting? And is that really a, like an accurate depiction of all of the information that's out there? So the internet is really great in that we have so much access to information, and more people than ever before are able to access this information. But at the same time, people are vulnerable to disinformation, and not all of the information on the internet, as we know, is factual. And it's a great place for trolls and for people to, impersonate, different people on social media and put forth fake stories and stuff like that. So in order to have a deliberation such as this one, we need to have a free press, and we need to have access to this information. And in order to be able to really understand the information, we need some kind of media literacy education. So in order to promote the common good, I believe that we need media literacy and civic education. I think starting in, even elementary schools, middle schools, high schools. And, whenever I was applying to college, I needed to have 3 years of a foreign language, 3 years of science, and 4 years of math, but there was no political science requirement or anything along those lines. And if the past few years have shown us anything, it's that we need more of that in order to better function as a society, and to be able to, better understand what we are grasping online. And I think that people have, there's so much information out there, there might be a skewed perception of what journalists do or what journalism is in the media. So I think it's important to be able to tell people and, help people discern fact from fiction online, because this is, the internet is such an asset to our society, but it can also be a weapon used against us. And so I believe that through this media literacy education, we are able to have deliberations and make each other uncomfortable by sharing different opinions and hearing different opinions, because without being made uncomfortable, we are unable to grow, and we need to be able to grow as a society. And that is the common good.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Marks.
Our children are dying in the corridors and classrooms of their schools, not just in Parkland, Florida, but all across the country. Our children are being poisoned by lead in the water, not just in Flint, Michigan, but all across the country. Our children are being poisoned by manganese dust in their playgrounds in eastern Ohio, among other places. Our children are being poisoned by fracking fluid in their well water in western Pennsylvania, among many other places. We can and will have academic debates about what the common good is, who gets to determine it, and how we should pursue it. But public health and the environment are essential components of the common good, and anyone who tries to tell you otherwise, with apologies to the Princess Bride, is trying to sell you something. I don't believe that government's inherently good and that corporations are inherently evil, But we should expect corporations to act to promote their commercial interests. Those are the structural incentives we have created for them. It is, however, the responsibility of government to protect and promote public health and the environment, two essential components of the common good. But today, our governments are partnering with the very actors responsible for creating the problems our governments are supposedly trying to solve. So to address obesity, they partner with fast food companies, snack food companies, and soda companies. To solve the opioid epidemic, our federal government is partnering with drug companies, including those that downplayed the addiction risks of OxyContin and other prescription opioids that are so responsible for the problems we have today. Gun violence and gun control is a public health issue, among other issues, but Congress is so dependent on campaign finance and industry funding and lobbying, and it is not taking action to protect our children from guns. Governments collaborate with the gas industry to create fracking databases and to draft environmental legislation. Every generation has a concern with the common good and the way in which it is used and abused. For Europeans, hundreds of years ago, it was about the monarch exercising eminent domain in order to deprive him or her of their private property. Today, the peril is governments conflating the common good with common ground. Government should not confound the common good with achieving common ground with industry actors, and yet that has become the way in which they are solving or trying to solve or purporting to solve fundamental problems of public health and the environment. If our governments are serious about solving these public health and environmental problems, whether it be obesity, climate change, gun violence, opioid addiction, they should be ready to explore all potential remedies, including those that are inimical to the interests of industry actors. And we should demand that our governments tussle with, struggle with, and where necessary, enter into direct conflict with corporations in order to protect and promote public health and the environment, two essential components of our common good.
Thank you. Michele Kennerly.
Got my heart racing, so give me a second here. Well, as you all can see, I stake my claim in the very roomy expanse between a dismissal of the common good and a devotion to it. And again, it's a roomy space, so I hope having this time to talk you through my thinking a little bit will help you determine where it is I sit within it. I'm going to start then with the caution quotes, which are a staple of postmodern thinking. So if any of you saw them and thought, let me disabuse you of that cringe moment. Although maybe perhaps this will not help, because my understanding of the movement of a notion of the common good into English is through Thomas Aquinas, the 14th century theologian. He was writing in Latin, and some of you might be like, just drop the mic. That's a great point. That's all you need. But let me go on. So Latin does not have an absolute article. So there's no, when one is reading Latin, one cannot conceive of the common good. It's grammatically impossible in that language. And I'm not a debater, but I know enough about debate to know that I haven't just won it on that point. So let me continue on to say that I don't think that it's really Aquinas we can learn from in his definitions of common good in Latin, but rather the lack of the definite absolute article. And I think that that is an important part of our discussion because it encourages us to think about the notion of a common good rather than a totalizing absolute superintending the common good. I think that when we start thinking about then a common good, we think about, to use Brendan's term, plural common goods potentially. And I think that really points to my sense in thinking about this question about a need to recognize who and what have been advantaged and disadvantaged by assertions about and assessments of the common good. So if we're willing to admit of a common good, we need to consider it stipulative and provisional and typically temporary. That is, discussions and deliberations about it need to be ongoing and unfurling consistently. And we also need to think about who's being asked to make concessions to commonality and whether those concessions are voluntary or involuntary. And I think we're doing okay for time, but just so I don't clip into any of Daniel's, I'll just speak to the point about domination as well. So our lawyer friend here could tell us that when lawyers are thinking through a case, they oftentimes wonder, and here's that old Latin phrase, cui bono. Usually in Law and Order and such, it's translated as who benefits. And that kind of works, but it also sounds a little bit economic in a way that's a little displeasing to me. So if we translate it more literally as to or for whom is this good, then we get a question about commonality and goodness that encourages us to think about plurality and, again, who is being advantaged by this definition of the common and the good and who is not. So I think overall we need to make room for skepticism and refusal. We need to make rooms for groups to say, this might be common for you, but it is not for me. And even if we can find a community, however you want to define that, that can agree on a shared vision of good life or what promotes flourishing, be it human or non-human animal or those two in cooperation, you'd be hard-pressed to find any community anywhere that will agree on how to pursue and promote it.
Thank you. Daniel Zahn.
All right. So first I'm going to speak about the dangers of outsourcing the pursuit of the common good away from the individual and into more of a governmental system or a societal system. And then I'm going to discuss why the individual pursuit of the common good and collectively promoting an individual's ability to pursue the common good is going to lead to the common good. So I really think it's based on the individual's success in accomplishing the good and what's good for them. And Brendan and Dr. Kennerly touched on it a bit, but talking about how it's not the good, but it's what's good for each individual. And as long as those goods are compatible and they're reasonable, then each individual will be able to pursue that good. And when individuals are able to realize what's good for themselves and for those around them without using the oppressive or dominating force that sometimes happens when the government or society tries to strive for the common good, since that tends to lead to the common good for the majority rather than the common good for each individual involved in that government and in that society. But when we focus on the individuals and allowing them to pursue their good, then the collective of the individuals creates and serves this common good. And Adam Smith notes that individual ambition serves the common good, and I would slightly amend it to be that individual ambition for the good will serve the common good of all individuals. And I think that the individual is best equipped to pursue their own good and then to make it able so that others can also pursue their good. And I think that is more the role of the society, is to make sure that each individual has the proper rights and the proper access and the proper education for them to have the ability to pursue their good. So we find examples in the past when individuals are oppressed or individuals are displaced because of this idea of, oh, it'll be good for the common good, and then they're unable to pursue their individual good, which then makes the common good an unattainable aspect. So I think when each individual is able to accomplish the good, and when we turn around and make it so that each person has an ability to accomplish the good, then it's going to lead and serve to the common good.
Thank you. Jeremy Engels.
Hi. Thanks for coming tonight, everyone. I thought I would tell you a story. Over spring break, I had the opportunity to go to India and to Nepal for some research. And walking around in Kathmandu in Nepal after spending a day at a meditation center, I met this amazing man who was named Binod, and he was a shopkeeper in the area around Patan. And it's an area that's really famous for its sculpture. And we got to talking, and it kind of came out that I was interested in questions of philosophy and ethics and communication, and also that I was a yoga teacher, and he got incredibly excited. He said, "You have to sit down, we have to talk." So he pulled out some chairs, and he brought his family out and set some tea down. And so we sat down, and he looked at me, and he said, "What is the meaning of life?" No beating around the bush. What is the meaning of life? In thinking back on that moment, I realized if we can't answer that question, how can we answer other questions? If we don't know what's good for us individually, how can we know if there is a common good and what that common good would be? I don't believe that we can. And that's why I argue in my somewhat strange idiosyncratic statement that we should focus on pursuing individual spiritual development rather than the common good. So what is the meaning of life? Bernard asked again. And so I stalled, as we do when we get these kinds of questions, by saying, oh, this is a really complicated question, blah, blah, blah. And he said, what is the meaning of life? And I said, well, for many yogis, the meaning of life is moksha, freedom from suffering. And he said, sure, that's a fine answer for great sages, but it's not a good answer for me. What is the meaning of life? For me and for you. And I said, do you really want to know what I think the meaning of life is? And he said, yes, I do. And I said, I believe that the meaning of life is to be worthy of life. To be prepared to meet what happens to us with a sense of wonder, joy, gratitude, serenity, and steadfast resolution, as opposed to meeting life with fear, cowardice, and resentment. He thought this was a good answer, and so as good students of Socrates, even though we're from halfway across the world from each other, we pursued this question a little further. And we agreed that if we take this definition of being worthy for life, ready to meet life, that means immediately that we must recognize that no one lives alone. That we are all dependent upon other beings and upon the earth. And so we must open ourselves to this dependence, what the Buddhist scholar Thich Nhat Hanh calls our inner being, rather than trying to wall ourselves off from the world. We must open ourselves to others as collaborators who make life possible, and also to the all on which life depends. So we cannot be prepared for life, we cannot be worthy of life, ready to meet life, unless we recognize that our lives are lived in common. We're made up of the same molecules, the same words, the same thoughts as others. We walk on the same earth, we breathe the same air, we drink the same water. And so our lives, our capacity to be ready to live, rests on our ability to capitalize upon, but also to maintain and manage these common resources in collaboration with others. So here we see that individual spiritual development leads to a more sure and persuasive conception of the common good because it makes a vague and general term into a subject that is real and pressing immediately for us. Now I recognize that no one can answer the question of what is meaningful, what a meaningful life is for each of you. But I would wager that when you ask that question of yourself, you will be led back to this way of thinking that helps you to realize that your life as an individual is in fact a life lived in common.
Thank you. We'll now begin the second round of voting. You have a minute or so to reconsider now that you've heard what the views actually are. And if you have questions, you can be developing them over the next 15 minutes and just, put your hand up. Does anyone still need a moment for voting? No, it looks like we're ready to reveal round two. Great. So now, okay. So now we have about 15 minutes for intra-panel discussion, and I wanted to get it started off by observing that there's a pretty even split between skepticism about the value of talking about the common good and, as it were, non-skepticism about the value of talking about the common good. So I wanted to start the first conversation with Michele, given that the three people to your right are speaking of the common good quite unproblematically and quite, as it were, powerfully. Your view, I believe, is that we really need to be sure we're questioning all elements of the discussion of the common good, maybe before we go forward. So can you tell us how you're reacting to that lack of problematicity in the speakers to your right?
Yes. Well, again, this is not a marker of selfishness, but I feel like I should communicate where my centering of skepticism came from. So I study ancient rhetoric, and to do that properly, you have to study ancient poetics and ancient philosophy and ancient warfare and ancient history and a lot of other things. So I know Aristotle fairly well as Christopher does and not as well as Mark does, but decently well. And so I went there first to find a good definition of the common good in Aristotle. And what I found I actually quite liked, but then I thought, this definition doesn't apply to me, and doesn't apply to immigrants in Athens, say. It doesn't apply to young men. It doesn't apply to children. It doesn't apply to enslaved people. It doesn't apply to animals, and it doesn't apply to the environment, and so on and so forth. So even though it's a really good definition about, in terms of what promotes human flourishing among full members of a polity, and that's a lovely definition, if you think about what that means, it means know me and know a lot of us here. And so that's where my skepticism came from, that if we try to look at historical definitions of the common good, we have to think about what they exclude. So what I would commend my fellow panelists for is expanding well beyond what Aristotle and Cicero and Aquinas had to say about the common good, and actually looking at these other populations and systems and networks and hyper-objects that these kind of philosophers upon whom we traditionally draw are not thinking of and not mindful of and not caring or careful about. So I really didn't see any tension here. I saw that I was reacting against a tradition that was quite exclusionary, and my friends here were talking about what we might call a burgeoning tradition.
Jonathan?
So it was interesting that you characterized me as I'm on the unproblematic side of the bench, because actually I share a lot with Michele, and in fact I quote in my book Jane Mansbridge, who said, the political philosopher, who says something along the following lines, that nothing is more necessary and more pernicious than the concept of, she was talking about the public good, but the same might be said of the common good. So I do think the concept is essential, and I think we have to be aware of the ways in which, at the same time, the concept might be abused. And so my anxiety is that the concept has been abused today in this sense, that we have substituted a more reflective notion of the common good with just doing whatever industry will agree to. And that, I think, is today's peril. So I do actually think that the concept is necessary and problematic.
Emily or Mark?
Well, I just wanted to add, it is something that, a common good, and you have to think about what is good for everybody and the different interests of different companies in society versus people and individuals coming together. And, in the case of Facebook, if you go on Facebook, you can actually go in settings and see if you're characterized as a liberal or conservative according to Facebook. And that's based on what you're interacting with, the content that you're engaging with on their site and sharing. And, Facebook and Instagram, these, they didn't begin as, they didn't start out at wanting to be purveyors of news information, but this is what they've become. So it's kind of like that responsibility, and the common good is wrapped in there, you know what I mean? And it's just that then it becomes a very complicated argument. Are these places for deliberation and discussion? And then, what is good for everybody? When you look at social media sites like this and dissemination of news.
So I think that Michelle's response is really helpful, the idea of a plurality of goods and overlapping goods. But I have an example that makes me suspicious of the opposite proposition, namely the proposition that individuals get to determine what's good for them, and that should be unproblematically assumed. I have a 2.5-year-old and two 1-year-olds, and they have a habit of taking things from each other. And if one of them takes something from another, because normally it's the 2.5-year-old, but it also, anyway, you get the idea. And complains, my 2.5-year-old complains very loudly if one of the girls takes something from him or is playing with something that he would speculatively in the future want to play with. So what is good for him is interfering with what is good for everyone. And so the individual good and the insistence on the rights of an individual to decide what is good can interfere with the common overlapping goods. And I think that is deeply problematic for us to, it's a problem for us to criticize the common good, but not, on the other hand, criticize the individual as the basis of good.
I think I would agree with that, except then I want to pose to you Bernard's question to Jeremy, which is, who else can make that? Who else can answer what's the meaning of, or to restate it, what's the meaning of my life? Because if you don't put the locus of deciding what's good for someone with the individual, where do you put it?
Well, I read Engels' answer in a totally different way. He started off by saying that the individual is the basis of the answer, and then his conclusion was the exact opposite, in fact. So his conclusion was that, in fact, we need to open our lives to our dependence on everyone else, and we need to think of ourselves as worthy of life in the context of many other things that are also worthy of life. So his answer actually undermined the starting point, or maybe better, shows that there's a cycle between them. That you can't think about the individual good as isolated from a common good, and on the other hand, you can't think about the common good as isolated from individual goods.
I agree. I actually do want to get Jeremy to say too, but just to clarify, I guess, where I'm coming from, I don't think I'm trying to say that we don't have to see ourselves as dependent or to respond to take our dependence seriously. Only that individuals recognize their dependence, recognize how that shapes what's good for them, but ultimately that, like Daniel was saying, individuals are the ones who are equipped to pursue that good. And so recognizing that we're dependent, recognizing that other people influence what's good for us, isn't taking away from us the need to assess what's good for ourselves. It's only giving us things we need to consider in making that determination.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'd like to respond to that. So that's actually something that I think is another problematic claim, the idea that individuals are in fact equipped to pursue what's best for them. My suggestion is that because we are embedded in systems that we can't extricate ourselves from, and we're in a room that is using electricity that comes from places that we may or may not agree with, right, or may not have good effects for everyone. So our insertion in the world means that we belong to systems that accomplish things without our consent. And that means that the individual is not in a position to make a decision about what is good for them in that situation. In fact, the individual needs to act in such a way that we transform those systems so that they do serve the good, including the individual good.
Jeremy, would you like to chime in and also clarify what, in fact, your position is? Unless it's just embracing all positions.
That was fantastic. I marvel at the collective wisdom on this panel, and honestly would just rather listen to other people talk. But I think that Mark is right and I think honestly the story that I told is actually indicative of the circling, spiraling patterns of my own thought on this question, because I've had the privilege now of teaching a graduate seminar and an undergraduate class on the common good. And I found that one of the biggest challenges to having a discussion about the common good is in fact getting people interested in the question itself. So what is it that can inspire us to have a conversation like we're having today? What is it that creates that spark of interest? And I think that the individual question of what is good for me can be a pathway into a broader conversation. I have the dual skepticisms that have been spoken about. I think that Michele talked about this roomy space, and I would like to maintain that roomy space as well, of a kind of skepticism of, I think individuals often posit goods that in fact are harmful to them and harmful to those around them all of the time. At the same time, those things that cultures define as common goods often are incredibly exclusionary, and as Michele said. And so I think we need to create this space. That's why partially I would love to just say what Michele said is what I think. So I would just vote for her. But I think that what she said is a nice addendum that we have to be conscious of how the common good can become an instrument of domination. I think we should be speaking about a common good. But at the same time, I think that we have to recognize that these questions become relevant for individuals as they relate to their own lives. That said, how it relates to their own lives can in turn help to open those lives up to a recognition of our mutual vulnerability in the fact that we live together. So, yeah.
Great. Daniel?
Yeah, I think there is something problematic about just allowing everyone to individually pursue what they consider good. And I think that Brendan was right in his initial statement when he talked about how it's okay as long as the individual good is compatible. And I think part of that is educating people on what is the good so that they have the ability to pursue that good. Because although systems are able to accomplish a lot for you, I have a hard time agreeing that systems are able to accomplish the good for you. You being in a system and it just allowing you to just pursue the good and embrace the good. I think it's an individual commitment that you need to make, and those systems can give you the ability and the education to determine the good that's compatible with society and compatible with yourself, but not necessarily to such an extent that they can give you what's good for yourself without an individual input and efficacy to it.
Yeah. So, Brendan?
I think just to jump in on that too, I think the problem that I'm seeing as well is that I don't see how a system could have a conception of the good. So it seems to me like an individual conception of the good has to recognize our embeddedness in systems and has to recognize how we could act to make those systems further a conception of good. But we as human beings are the ones who can actually hold a conception of the good and can make a normative claim that, oh, this system, for example, the one you used, of how we consume our food and how that has repercussions for the food supply, for the oceans, for nature, that ultimately it's not the plastic that's deciding that the plastic is bad for us and for the ocean. We need to make that recognition and say, this is harmful, this is wrong, this is bad, and now as actors and as beings capable of holding a conception of the good, we need to go out and change these systems which are agnostic towards that conception.
Okay, so the key word that I'm wondering about, and so let me just say, I think that the idea of a plurality of views on the good is compatible with what I'm suggesting. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the one thing that I would want to question about what you're saying just now is the idea that the good has to be conceived, that it has to be thought by a person. So if I take your suggestion to be like quite literal, then what you're saying is that the fish and the birds and the animals and the bugs and the earth, so we could destroy those things and there would be no good and bad in that. But a person has to come along and think that it's good or bad. I'm presuming you don't agree with that position.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
In which case, conceiving of the good is not something that is important to as it were, the conception of the good that I'm putting forward. A system can have repercussions that are good or bad without a person being the one to judge them. So I'm decentering a human being from the position or role of the decider of the good.
Okay, so I think where maybe we might disagree is then to say, I would agree with you if you say like, oh, the plastic we're putting in the ocean is killing fish. But I don't know how many species of fish died out before humans were in a position to kill them due to natural selection and environmental forces. I wouldn't turn around and say, oh, well, all those species that went extinct due to natural causes before we were around to mess it up, that, oh, that was bad. I think that only once we come to have actors and actions and the ability to make these kinds of decisions can we start talking in the language of good and bad. So the fact that a species of fish doesn't exist anymore is bad when it comes about as a result of our kind of corrupting influence, but isn't bad just because it is. And so I think the reason I wouldn't say, it's not the fish have to think, wow, I've been horribly wronged. It's that we have to recognize that we're wronging the fish.
So let's pause on this moment of pluralism, and I want to remind the audience that if you have written questions, to put your hand up so that it may be collected by the ushers, and you will have a moment or two to write these questions. Also, during the Q&A period, if you do have additional questions, again, people will keep their eyes out for them. Great, thank you. Perfect, thank you.
I'll be back here if anybody.
Okay, so our first question is for Jeremy. And the question is, in the context of our discussion of the common good, what do you mean by spiritual development, rather than, for example, moral or educational or some other form of development?
So I'm thinking of a definition of spirituality that tends to be shared both. The two traditions that I think most inspire me would be the Stoic tradition in the West, and then more of a yogic Vedantic tradition, especially related to the Bhagavad Gita. And in both of those two traditions, spirituality is often talked about as a set of practices by which we undertake a change on ourselves so we can see the world differently. And so it's intimately related to questions of philosophy and ethics and morality. But I'm thinking, as a student of rhetoric, exercises that we undertake either on ourselves or in conversation often with others that encourage us to see and feel and interact with the world differently. So that would be the definition of spirituality that I would give. And I think then that spirituality can, in fact, be used in the service of something like a common good. And so that separation between individual and inner being really, for me, evaporates.
Great, thanks. So the next question is for Jonathan Marks, and that is, you spoke about the government being responsible for environmental issues, safety issues, but to what extent do you think that the government should be responsible for social issues to the extent that they're connected to the common good?
I guess I'd want to know what the questioner meant by social issues.
But maybe you can imagine.
Maybe I'm suffering from a paucity of imagination this evening. I mean, the reason why I picked public health and the environment is, and I'm actually inspired by a lot of what Jeremy says, and I'm going to go home tonight and really interrogate myself as to whether I am leading a truly worthy life, because I need to find a little more joy, perhaps. But I am worried about the things that we can't do anything about individually. And we can't choose the water we drink. The people in Flint, Michigan didn't decide to divert the river. That was a public official, or divert the water supply. That was a public official. I can't decide whether or not manganese dust is going to land on my children's playgrounds. These are cases where there is a compelling case for the government to act to protect us because we cannot do this ourselves. So, I mean, if the questioner has a particular social issue, I mean, do you call gun violence a social issue? Well, I call it also a public health issue. And so that comes within my category of issues where I think government has a responsibility to act. So if the questioner wants to specify a particular social issue, I'd happily address it, but that's my thought thus far.
Great. So the next question is for the panelists generally, and it is a somewhat deep epistemic issue. And that is whether individuals or society could be assumed to have any capability of knowing what is good for them. That is, we might just all be in a kind of illusory state where we think things seem good to us, but in fact, we have no idea. And so the question is, how can we decide and pursue a common good if we might, in fact, be wrong about it?
I have a quick thought. So my worry is the role that powerful corporate actors, you may be not surprised to hear, shapes what we think of as being for the good. And again, that to me is one of the contemporary perils. We have all come to believe that the best way to communicate with each other is via Facebook, and we now learn that that comes at a cost. We've all come to believe that social media is the most effective way to interact, and yet that may have an impact on road traffic accidents. All sorts of, we are very anxious about government interventions that might influence our behavior, but we seem to be totally on board with our behavior being influenced by powerful corporate actors who are framing our understanding of social as well as environmental and public health problems in ways that are consonant with their interests. So yes, I do have an anxiety about it, but I think my concern is the way in which that plays out today.
I can answer a different part of the question. I agree with Jonathan about that concern. So there are many things that we may not know about what the good is on certain levels, but there are basic levels on which it's very clear what is good. Not getting shot with a gun is good. Not imbibing lead when you're a child is good. Health is something that we know a heck of a lot about, and people's decisions in relation to health are informed by good science. Certain kinds of social relationship are not good for people, and these things are widely acknowledged. Certain mental states are harmful or difficult, or isolation of individuals is harmful for them. We know so many things about what is good for people, basic things, that to say that we have no idea what the common good is problematic. And to say that there is no answer or there is no way to find out an answer to what is good for human beings is also problematic, since we do know a lot. So instead of worrying about, for the moment, instead of fretting about disagreements about the ultimate common good, I think we should take heart that we actually do know a lot about what is good. So that's how I would start it. And be optimistic about how much more we'll learn.
Anybody else?
I think I would just, in response to the extreme nihilistic position that says that individuals can never know what is good for them, I might quote some William James or some Walt Whitman, but I think actually I'd just go back to the founding mission of the Pennsylvania State University as a land-grant institution, that the goal of this institution is to train citizens. And I think that we as educators, if we do not believe that individuals have the capacity to see things more clearly, if we do not believe that individuals have the capacity to determine what is good for them and others, if we do not believe that individuals have the capacity to communicate and cooperate, then I don't know what we're doing here, actually. And so for me, actually, that question really cuts to the heart of what it is I do as an educator every day when I'm in the classroom.
I would agree and also add that I don't think it matters so much, even if we can't know definitively the common good. Like, even if we can't reach, like, the peak of the mountain, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't stop climbing towards it and shouldn't stop our discovery into what is good for us and what is good for society. Even if we can't reach the top, we shouldn't abandon all hope, because we have discovered so much of what is good and how we can improve that I feel it's necessary to try and get further, even if we can never get to the finish line.
Right.
Can I have one?
Please, Michele.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I mean, I think if we were to look at the history of invocations of the common good, it would look a lot like the history of invocations of common sense, and really it would be an inventory of folly. So I would say that assertions of a common good must be adjustable and responsive, but I don't want to at all risk underemphasizing how difficult and slow those adjustments are.
Great. So this question is for Emily, and that is maybe similarly skeptical, and the questioner is wondering how we can detect fake news even with media literary education, since we can't be knowledgeable about all topics. And so presumably, if we believe that fake news or whatever kind of news we're talking about is going to be causing so much, as it were, skewing of thought about the common good, do we not have a major problem? Or rather, we can ask, how does media education really get us where we need to be?
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of different cases. I know more recently there was a specific case on Facebook where companies were targeting millennials, and prior to this, I think the general consensus was that a lot of people of the older generation who primarily got their news from the television and then got on Facebook, and then during the election they were sharing a lot of content, that they were being affected by fake news. But everybody is vulnerable to this, and I think with media literacy education, understanding different companies and different news organizations, and the training behind what journalists have and the ethics that journalists who are trained as journalists have to abide by, as opposed to different organizations that have ties. They're not real organizations and stuff. And so you can look, being able to look into the background behind these organizations and understanding, what is fake news and doctored images. For example, Emma Gonzalez, one of the leaders behind the March for Our Lives this past weekend, there's a picture of her going viral on Twitter tearing up the Constitution. And even though many different news organizations published the undoctored image of her tearing up a Target, many people are still sharing this image on Facebook and on Twitter, and saying things that implies that they still believe it's real. So it's challenging, but I think if we're trying to get people on the same page here, and I understand that's hard. Last semester in a media studies class, I watched a video about how people are not convinced by facts, which is not that surprising, I guess. But whenever you come up to people and you go, well, these are the statistics, and this is the research behind the statistics, people, it's human nature. You want to reaffirm your own beliefs, and you're closed off to that new information that counters your beliefs. But whenever you go up to other people and we're both students, we're both women, we're both from Pennsylvania. When you make a connection, then it's easier to gain trust and have a conversation.
Thank you. The next question is for Brendan, and that is, given your statement that there's no common good, the questioner wonders why you are here.
That is a good question.
We wanted him here. We wanted him here.
No, I think that's a good question. I think the short answer would be that if the question is what is the common good and should we always promote it, to me the answer, there is no common good makes both of those questions obsolete. So I think that it would be that it's an important thing. It's an important threshold question before we can ask what is the common good, and definitely before we can ask should we promote it. I think it's important to start with, is there a common good? And so when we have ideas about, well, maybe there's multiple common goods, maybe there's things that are good for some people and not for other people, and we have to be cautious about how we weigh them. It seems to me like what we're talking about there is, like Michele says, it's not the common good. Maybe it's a common good, maybe it's some common goods, common to who. Questions like that I think are important before we move on to the conversation about trying to identify the common good and talk about promoting it. I think the other thing that's important too is, I know Chris put me in the skeptical camp at the beginning, the skeptical of the common good. I think I definitely occupy the most skeptical end of that by saying it doesn't exist. But I think it's important, I think having a healthy degree of skepticism is important for the same reason that our questioner who asked the question about, well, if you don't know what the common good is, how can you start promoting it? I think that factors into the same kind of conversation I want to have about if we say something's the common good, how we might be moving up the mountain and not reaching the top, but we might also be going back down the mountain. And so I think it's important to pause and to have that healthy degree of skepticism, and before we start talking about the common good, to talk about what would it need to be in order to be the common good? Who would have to share it? Whose interest would it serve? Is it enough that it helps powerful corporations? Does it have to serve everybody? Can it contribute to structures of domination, or does it have to oppose them? And I think before we answer those threshold questions about what the common good is, it doesn't really make sense to move on and talk about, or before we answer the threshold questions about what the common good would need to be, it doesn't make sense to move on to conversations about what the common good is.
Another question for Jonathan Marks. Given that governments pursue national interests, do we need a world government to truly arrive at the common good?
So I do believe in the international legal order, and I do believe in international and intergovernmental organizations, yes. And so for the sake of, a one-sentence summary, that's what I said. But if I had been given the chance to create a longer statement, I would have emphasized the importance of intergovernmental organizations. And I'll also just explain to you very quickly the similar pearls. So the World Health Organization should be the global coordinating body for international health, or public health, however you want to call it. But the problem with the WHO is it's drastically underfunded. It only really gets to determine what it does with about 30% of its budget. The rest all comes from voluntary contributions, not assessed contributions, and from charitable donations and the like. And they come with strings attached. And so we have a situation where an underfunded international body has to look for corporate partners as well as philanthropic foundations in order to do its work. And that is deeply problematic. In fact, the WHO has something called the Global Coordinating Mechanism, which is a partnership with a variety of of other actors, including the private sector, because it is worried about being as having no influence. So what we need to do is to better fund intergovernmental organizations like the WHO so that it can do the job of protecting public health, which, as I say, is an essential component of the common good.
Yes, Brendan.
Just to double up on the question then, the point you raised about the voluntary contributions, presumably those are made because they're in national interest, corporate interest, or philanthropic interest, which goes back to the original question about if individual actors, whether they're governments or corporations or whatever, if they're going to promote their individual interests, how can you get them to provide the additional funding for an intergovernmental organization like the WHO?
So ideally, you would have a system of mandatory contributions that are more substantial than the current mandatory contributions, and you would try and create an institutional culture where states are not simply focused on their own interests. And I'll tell you who can help with that. There are many NGOs that have official relations with the WHO, and their interests tend not to be neatly divided along national grounds. What they're concerned about is addressing some disease or condition which affects people in multiple countries, across national borders, or this infectious disease which knows no national boundaries. So I think with the right funding, I'm optimistic that an organization like the WHO could transcend national interests and do things which are necessary for global health. I just think we need a better funding mechanism.
This is a question for Daniel, and that is, given what we know about various factors that determine people's interests, sociological factors, cultural factors, ideological factors, financial factors, how can anyone truly pursue their individual good in, as it were, a free way, rather than just doing what they're as programmed to do?
Yeah. So I think it again draws back to this promotion of people's ability, in that we need to educate people and not necessarily indoctrinate them, but educate them on how to pursue the good and what is good, and give them the ability and the rights to exercise those abilities so that they can move forward and they can learn what they want and they can go after what they want and they can achieve any type of success or any type of thing that is going to give them tranquility and allow them to achieve the good. So I think it's about working with the individual so that they have the ability to pursue that good without trying to pursue the good for them.
Great. This is a question for Mark, and the question is essentially about how do we make the decisions related to environmental or natural protection, given that, I think the background of the question is given that those kinds of decisions can often be ones that are connected to other kinds of political or cultural or social factors, preventing, the use of forestry products, puts certain people out of work, and so forth. So one can appreciate that there is a common good, but how do we get there?
Yeah. So I think there might be two questions involved, or two questions that come up in relation to that. One question: how do we relate to the natural world insofar as we don't understand all of the ways that we are embedded in the natural world? So how do we relate to the natural world when we aren't aware of all the consequences of our actions on the context of our lives? If we kill off all of the wolves in Yosemite National Park, then the deer start to eat the trees, and the grasses start to decline. If the grasses decline, erosion increases, and the rivers increase in speed, and then the fish disappear, and certain kinds of living creatures in the forest disappear, and the rivers change their course. Right? How do we talk about interacting with and respecting the natural world when it's so delicately we are so delicately embedded into it? Well, there's a precautionary principle. Whatever consequences will occur, stop well before you get to those to really dire consequences. That's one. I mean, that's about the best we can do. And then when we find out more, you change the pattern. But the other thing is, and this is so the other question that I think is important in relation to this is not just to think about a relationship with the natural world as harmful. We know many ways to act in positive ways to improve the vitality and the health and the flourishing of the natural world, and we should pursue those. It turns out that many of those things are in fact also good for us, in that, for example, the organic farming that I referred to earlier creates many more times the jobs and profits for individual farmers than industrial agriculture does. And similarly with things like renewable energy, many more times the number of jobs are created by investing in renewable energy than investing in fossil fuels. So these things are win-win situations. We should seek more of those. And we should look to do positive goods, not just to avoid doing harm to the natural world.
Can I just piggyback on the
Sure, John.
precautionary principle? So there are many different formulations of the precautionary principle, and one of them is, in the face of serious and irreversible harm to the environment or health, the lack of scientific certainty should not be an excuse for inaction. And one of the reasons why the principle in that context is very important is if you read a book called Doubt is Our Product, it describes, by David Michaels, it describes a history of powerful industry actors across a variety of sectors deliberately trying to create doubt from the tobacco industry onward in order to stave off regulation. Mm-hmm. And the precautionary principle is a nice antidote to that industry strategy.
Great. There's another question for you, Jonathan. And that is that since lobbying leads to a lot of changes in the choices that the government makes, how, in your view, can this kind of influence, this lobbying influence, be limited so that government can help achieve the common good?
So I do think lobbying is a major problem. And there have been some debates in the US as to how one can address, for example, campaign finance reform as well as lobbying, and what can we do about Citizens United, and do we need a constitutional convention? One of the things that I will say as somebody who's a European by birth is that very often what we saw is corporations complying with regulations, like the REACH regulation in Europe, which requires corporations to show that products, household products, are not carcinogenic, teratogenic, or endocrine disruptors. Those very same corporations that were complying with those regulations in the EU were lobbying against any kind of regulatory reform in California that might impose similar regulations. So I think lobbying is a major problem, and I think campaign finance is a major problem, but I think we are in a position to do something about it. I have a friend whose 15-year-old son has created an app. In fact, you don't even need a device. You can look at it on your computer, and he'll show you which of your politicians has received money from the oil and gas industry, from the gun industry or the gun lobby, and you should act on that. And you should pick politicians who are not going to take money from industry, but rather are going to act to protect your health and the environment.
Great. This is a question for Emily, and that is, I had a question about public deliberation, and that is that a lot of people who are thoughtful shy away from public discourse, often because the loudest voices, which have the most extreme views, just cover them up. How can the public combat these two issues, that is, the quietness on the one side and the over loudness on the other side?
Well, I think that, whenever people will have, more of a media literacy and civic literacy and engagement aspect or component to their education and implement it in their communities, I feel like sometimes it's more not so much a quiet and over loudness, but perhaps people don't fully understand the situation, or they don't, whenever we have all the access to information, people are more knowledgeable about it and perhaps more confident in sharing their ideas, but also, sometimes, take for example the march this weekend, that was, completely, that was organized via social media, but, it was organized by young people with the help of adults for, logistical purposes and everything like that. But they were able to get their voices heard, and, I think just the more that people realize how they can engage in a public forum and in society, and I think that people really are becoming more civically minded. So I think we are moving in a direction where that is less the case.
Great.
Can I glom onto that one?
Yes, please, Michele.
And that is, I sometimes wonder how much our situation of information overabundance and being able to easily access information all the time, everywhere, is actually a huge obstacle to confidence, because it makes you feel like you never can get your arms or whole body around an issue. And if you're someone who prides yourself on being informed, you don't want people to have some little weird piece of information that you haven't considered who have, this set you up for a gotcha moment. And so I feel like information oversaturation, information abundance, and easy access actually can be a huge obstacle to those of us who tend to be a little bit more shy and really want to seem informed when we speak. So I would say, if you have a modicum of information at your fingertips, then let that give you a bit of confidence to enter into these arenas and bring your voice.
Mark, short comments.
Add to that. So there are some media sources who take it as their mission to take research and existing well-established literature and digest it in such a way that they can reflect and represent the major complex issues. And media organizations that are like that, I think, are invaluable right now. And the more of them, the better. But there are some of them. So I think this can help. A person can feel like when we collaborate together for the common good, we in fact can represent the complexity of the common good better to ourselves, and we can deliberate better as a team.
A brief comment, Brendan?
Yeah, just to add one last thing on. I think this also, that comment especially, and what we've been talking about, goes back to a question that was asked earlier about how do you know what's fake news? And I think it's worth taking a second, or taking some time actually, and going out and finding sources that do that kind of careful analysis, and finding sources that you can trust, and finding sources that have a reputation for publishing real news, and going out and finding your news and not letting your news find you. Because when you're on the internet and something pops up and it makes you feel good and it tells you that everything you've ever believed is true and correct and that you're the smartest person in the world, that might give you lots of confidence, but it might also be coming from Russia, or it might also be coming from people whose political views you disagree with, or who are trying to manipulate you into behaving in a way that's in their interest and not in your own. And it's much harder for people to do that when you're proactive about going out and finding real news.
Jeremy or Daniel, any concluding remarks?
I was just going to mention on this topic that I think it's also important to expand what you consider a public discourse. It doesn't always need to be like a formal discussion where people are coming with all this information and are going to be loud. I think it's more about engaging with issues, the everyday diplomacy class, engaging with these issues all the time and making it a part of your day to discuss these things and to come to these conclusions so that you can engage with them as often as you'd like.
Yeah, and I think I would just say that communication, deliberation, dialogue are skills, right? We get better as we practice them. So let's get better.
That's great. So I want to say we'll have a chance to get better in an informal way in the reception following this event. We're going to put an end to the formal part of this discussion. We're going to have now the third round of voting to see what really is the case about the common good. So please do that now. Can I see what the interface looks like? Oh, you already finished. Okay, great.
That was fun.
Oh, yeah. I'm sitting at the other side. It's just a screen. Right?
I've read a lot of in the last few days. Using
So is anyone still need a moment? Yes, okay.
I've seen these things with deep embedded images where instead of looking like QR codes, they look like normal photographs, but if you put a QR code reader up to them, the information is in there.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah. I just think that the point about the tension between being informed and being at risk of being misinformed is an important one.
Yeah.
I know so many people who like walking to and from class and stuff are staring at their phones and they're not just public media, they're also right.
Are you guys done? Or are you still? Are you done? Are you still in the middle of?
If your news makes you feel good, look elsewhere.
Right. Especially if it makes you feel righteous.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's even better.
If your news makes you feel self.
Okay.
Makes you feel good.
Yes. All right. Let's see the results of the third vote. Wow.
Engels squeaked it.
That was a lot of.
Actually, lost people, but I think we collectively lost
Well,
some people.
yeah, no, but this looks like it's a quite common set of results.
Yeah, that's great. Everybody.
So as we reflect on these results, let's give our deepest appreciation to the 6 panelists here. Seven panelists. Sorry, Brendan.